Hi, I'm Quinn and I'm autistic, and this is Autistic. If you're around my age and British, then you'll know who William Hague is, even if you wish you didn't. He's a political blowhard who served as a caretaker leader for one of the UK parties whilst they licked their wounds between elections years ago, and now he fills up a seat in the House of Lords. He's one of those footnotes in recent political history who pops his head up now and again to make sure he hasn't been completely forgotten. If you're not British, maybe think along the lines of a US senator who nobody's heard of outside their home state, but with less actual power and none of the actual constituents or responsibility. He invaded my attention span briefly a few days ago by making the sweeping statement that people in their 60s right now are the luckiest generation there's ever been. It was obviously intended to stir up a bit of political discussion and score points against the opposition in the media. I felt a bit weird about the case he was trying to make, that being born 60 years ago made your life easy just because things are harder in some ways now, because I'm already closer to 60 than I'd like, and half my generation are in their 60s already and apparently living the life of Riley, according to him. But I don't actually know many Gen Xers who feel like we had it easy growing up. Oh, you'll hear plenty of tales about how things were better in our day, simpler certainly, maybe even more fun, but easier? I'm not so sure. But maybe, I thought to myself, that's because my perspective is skewed by the old autism thing. I'm not saying old Willy Boy is any more switched on to the average Joe in the street than I am, but I am autistic, and so are thousands of the people I've met since I was diagnosed back in the 80s. Most of my friends now are autistic or neurodivergent. Perhaps my view of growing up and growing older in Generation X is different with autism thrown into the mix. So it doesn't matter your age or whether you're autistic or not. Why not pull up a pew and get yourself comfortable with a cup of something warm and inviting whilst we take an insider's look at Generation X autism. The problem with identifying an average autist of any age is that we're decidedly unaverage people when compared to the rest of the population. The most defining characteristic of who we are is that we're not quite the same as the people we talk to, work with and live with. We have a habit of standing out even when we try our hardest to fit in. So, if you really want a guide to who amongst you might be autistic, start looking at the people who don't quite fit in to start. But despite sharing a nature that laughs in the faces of averages, we nonetheless do share a great deal that other folks won't always see. So join me in a little tour through 3 different Generation X autistic lives. Adrien found out about his autism following a mental health crisis. Maybe during, he's still not sure where to draw the line. Up until then, he'd led a quite unremarkable but comfortable life, doing well enough at school to get onto a retail management track with a department store when he left school, one that wasn't just a YTS scheme pretending to be something actually worthwhile. He did pretty well learning and applying company procedures by the book until he was offered a position in a prestigious store miles away from home. He still lived with his folks at the time, and he didn't have a girlfriend. In fact, he'd not had a girlfriend at all, if he was actually honest, but he'd always steered the subject away from his romantic status whenever it came up. Thing is, he really didn't want to go, but he didn't have much choice in the matter. He had nothing holding him back, and there was no doubt it was a substantial promotion. He joked with his Star Trek-loving best friend that he'd been Rikered into the job. But the move actually suited Adrien really well. He got himself on the property ladder in his 20s, adopted a couple of cats, and met someone special. And a couple of years later, he was offered a step up from running the electrical department to an executive position. duty assistant manager of the whole store, 2 steps away from the local top job. And that's when the cracks started to show. Stepping into the executive office was supposed to have been a step up the ladder, but it didn't feel like it. He was now involved in the financials of the business and the staffing in a way he hadn't been before, and the clock started ticking down to the moment he'd hit the autistic wall. As duty assistant manager, he got lumbered with most of the paperwork his higher-ups really should have been doing. The store manager had been shirking it onto his assistant for years, who in turn learned to shuck it down further, but as the bottom rung of the executive tier, that meant Adrien. It didn't take him long to realise he was being taken advantage of, but his mum had always instilled in him about taking the rough with the smooth and paying your dues as you worked your way up the ladder, so he tried to take it on the chin. But one day it got too much for him. He had what was called at the time a breakdown after being asked for the 3rd time that day to make a decision way above his pay grade, prompting what he now knows to have been the mother of all meltdowns. He kept his job for the moment, but it set in motion the events that led a couple of years later to his autism diagnosis and his leaving retail. Now, Adrien still lives in the same town, in the same house he bought when he moved there nearly 30 years ago, but now he works in the civil service. He still has cats though, a girlfriend of 15 years and a new shared passion for Pokemon and Nintendo games. She's autistic too and runs a small business with Adrien helping out, making something they both love. Dileia is the oldest of our 3 Gen X autists today, but she's also the most recently diagnosed. She's suspected she might be autistic for about 7 or 8 years, even though her diagnosis was only last year. Unlike Adrien before, though, she didn't have a very good time at school. Whilst Adrien's relatively quiet nature did garner him a little flack in his school days, Dileia got relentlessly bullied by the girls at both her primary and secondary schools, largely because of her up and down weight. She has a relatively common autistic sensory quirk affecting her relationship with food. She can go for days without feeling hunger, only for it to suddenly hit her all at once, forcing her to gorge herself to feel sated. Of course, the 1980s, when Dileia was growing up, was also a battleground between food companies trying to tempt us and diet brands working just as hard to guilt us, and it saw a huge rise in awareness of eating disorders. Unfortunately, this was the track that Dileia found herself on, and it wasn't quite as enlightened as it is now. Right up until her early 20s, when she finally got away from her mum, Dileia was dragged from clinic to clinic. Everyone from specialist doctors through to nutritionists, psychologists, homeopaths and faith healers. Dileia's youth was a never-ending sequence of doctors, therapists and quacks all promising solutions to a problem Dileia kept protesting she didn't have. Meanwhile, she had other things on her mind that nobody would even listen to. After all, she was in denial about her eating disorders, so she'd say anything. All of the diagnoses of various eating disorders and psychological problems she'd picked up over the years rested on the assumption that her eating problems were driven by intent, by shame or dysmorphia. But she knew that wasn't true. She knew that her sense of hunger was out of whack, and nobody she tried to tell would believe her. They just kept turning back to her mum and asking her, who always told the doctors that it was intentional. Of course, all this going on in the background didn't help her at school. The amount of time she took off, along with the constant exhaustion of masking she didn't know she was doing, eventually became too much. Dileia left school at 16 with no qualifications to speak of and went straight into work. Sort of. In 40 years, Dileia never kept a job for more than a year, and most of them only lasted a few months. And it's not for want of trying. She's great at interviews. Even the people at the job centre knew that. She got nearly every job she interviewed for because she's really good at charming the bosses, but the jobs never last long because sooner or later her sensory problems would get too much. Dileia's a lovely person to meet. She's an absolute joy to be around, but any time you spend with her is borrowed. She has really acute sensory sensitivities in several areas, and she's got really good at masking her discomfort over the years, but sooner or later she'll wince or cry out at the wrong moment in front of the wrong customer, and it all unravels from there. Once the sensory spiral starts, it's difficult to stop. In her 30s, Dileia finally came out as gay. Perhaps if she'd been listened to when she was younger, she might have worked it out for herself sooner, but it was all eating disorders then, no time to worry about if she might like girls or anything. It was her dietitian wife who recognised that Dileia's childhood history of eating disorders that more or less vanished when she left home, and the odd antisocial eating habits she adopted since, might be down to something else. Interoception. But even knowing that wasn't enough to make the final penny drop. That came years later, when an autistic YouTuber described exactly the same kind of problems with hunger and digestion that she has, along with a few other spooky coincidences she couldn't ignore. She got her autism diagnosis aged 57. She considers herself one of the lucky ones, though, despite having probably the most abusive childhood out of the three, because she found her wife in the end. She believed in Dileia in a way nobody had before and helped her finally break the ties with her mother that had held her back for years. These days, Dileia helps out a little with the day-to-day running of her wife's clinic and doing her best to adjust to an empty nest now the second of their two daughters has gone to university. Terry is the most successful of our trio, at least in terms of status and financial security. He's the one most people would look at and think he'd be the happiest with his lot, and in some ways they'd be right. In quite a few respects, Terry's got everything he wants. He has a job which not only makes good use of the peaks on his spiky skill set, it's also tied in with his lifelong special interest, and he gets paid really well to do it. He enjoys lots of autonomy at work, able to take on projects that interest him and without many limits on his freedom. It's a dream job. But he isn't exactly happy. He doesn't have any of the sensory sensitivities Dileia has, and he's never actually had a meltdown like Adrien. But his job drives him round the bend every day, and he really doesn't know if he can take it much longer. Now, I'm not going to pretend that Terry is everybody's cup of tea. He's not an easy person to get along with, but he knows it too. He knows that people find him abrupt, forceful, and single-minded. Well, those are the words he prefers to use. He knows that behind his back, they say that he's arrogant, aggressive, and a know-it-all. But people tolerate it because he's almost always right, and his insight makes them a lot of money. Come to Terry with a problem within his specialist field, and he'll not only give you an answer, but a potted history of the entire topic and a whole laundry list of potential savings and efficiency improvements you could make. But you won't like the manner in which he tells you, or the many, many mistakes of yours he'll point out along the way. Not to put you down, but to help you improve. At least that's how he sees it. You'll bristle at his tone of voice, jump at his sudden exclamations, and take exception to his choice of words, but you'll never be able to fault the solutions he gives you. But for all the success he's enjoyed, the nice house he bought with his generous salary and the huge collection of sci-fi memorabilia a nerd like me can't help but drool over, Terry's not where he wanted to be in life. Because the one thing he wants but can't seem to find is meaningful human connection. People don't like him, and he knows why, but he can't help it. What they don't like about him is so much at the core of not only who he is, but also his profession. Accuracy and reliability are his bread and butter. I mean, people have told him over and over again, and he's tried so hard over the years to be accepted by people, but whatever he does to adjust his style to ingratiate himself and make friends, the one thing he can't do is stop correcting people. No matter how nicely he does it, how kind his words, or encouraging his tone, nobody likes constantly being corrected. But Terry can't help himself. If Delia's Achilles heel is her sensory differences, for Terry, it's his incredibly high sense of veracity. But he's a true polymath. His memory for facts and figures is astounding, and he does maths on the fly that would take others 10 minutes with a calculator, and he cooks the most wonderful roast dinner you've ever had. But he's also the bearer of possibly the most heightened sense of veracity I've ever come across, and he can't let it go when someone makes a mistake or says the wrong thing. So, for the last 10 or 12 years or so, he's been more or less a ghost to his posh neighbours with their Range Rovers and expense accounts. Early in the morning, he gets in his 15-year-old Ford and drives to work, then heads straight back indoors at night and draws the curtains until the next day. His garden gets overgrown every year until it blocks out the sun, and he gets a man in to cut it all down. There's even local rumours about him and what some of the neighbours think he gets up to behind his curtains, but they're all way off the mark. They'd be amazed if they saw. He's actually been building one of the most amazingly detailed and elaborate train sets you will ever see, taking up half of his massive basement, and it's still expanding. This is the way he's chosen to live his life, and he'll protect it fiercely if he's challenged. But he'll also admit that it's not the life he wanted. As much as he winds people up at work and leads a solitary life at home by choice, he'd like nothing more than to be, well, liked. Not in the transitory fashion of friends who come and go, but someone he can let into his life who'll see him for himself and be able to live harmoniously with his perfectionism and inability to ignore bad information. He's tried more than once to chill out, to try and coast along without any worries like everyone else seems to do, but he can't keep it up for long before the constant mosquito buzz of contradiction and bad information threatens to drive him round the bend. So, whilst Terry does sometimes get very lonely and has been known to cry himself to sleep at night, he's proud of his work and of his trains, and for now, that's enough. Thing is, he doesn't want a wife or a husband. He's never been interested in romance or intimacy. He needs a solid, reliable, trustworthy companion. He never wanted a family or someone to sleep next to, but he does want someone to help him finish his train set and enjoy it with him when he retires. But what about that average Generation X autist I mentioned at the beginning? Adrien, Dileia and Terry are all undoubtedly autistic, but they've hardly anything else in common. Thing is, knowing they're autistic, as they all do, is what actually makes them and me the rarity amongst Generation X autists. Dave here is closer to the average because he represents the majority. Dave currently doesn't have a clue he's autistic. You see, that's one of the most significant things that marks the autists of my generation apart from anyone born after us. Most of us still don't know why we're different, because nobody was diagnosing autism when we were kids. And once we were out of the education system, the chances of it being picked up faded away even as public knowledge about autism was expanding. It's difficult to accurately estimate how many of us there are because decent figures really aren't easy to find. But based on the number of autists being diagnosed as children now, compared to the huge gap in diagnosis for us Gen Xers, between 70 to 90% of us who would qualify for an autism diagnosis still have no idea that's why they've struggled through life. There's a number of reasons why that might be, not least of which being the stigma that was attached to learning disabilities and developmental difficulties when we were kids. We lived through times of incredible change when it came to public attitudes to disability, and we made great strides forward as a society in that time. But the world wasn't ready to accept neurodiversity back then. Some would argue it's kicking and screaming against it even now, but we're still a long way ahead of where we were back then. That stigma, that internalised ableism is still there in a lot of Gen X minds, blocking us off from accepting the possibility that our brains might not be normal. But likely the most significant barrier is ignorance about what autism actually is and what autistic lives look like. Because whilst I can say with full conviction that every one of those autists I told you about just now can lay claim to being pretty normal for an autist, those undiagnosed masses don't know enough about what an everyday autistic life is like to recognise that it could be their life too. Even now, almost everything you read about autism isn't about autistic people. It's lists of symptoms and behaviours, all related from an outsider's perspective. For all that we've learned in the 40-odd years since I first got told I'm autistic, we still describe it in terms that hardly anyone sees in themselves until a doctor tells them that's who they are. But how will we ever get to that doctor if we don't know what autism looks like from an insider's perspective? The Daves of this world don't know that they're as autistic as Adrien, Dileia, Terry or me, because they don't know that that's what autistic lives look like. They spend their lives struggling against the same autistic tides we have without knowing that's what they were. They think it's just them that think that way, feel that way, or act in that very specific manner. But that's what tells me and anyone who knows what they're looking at that Dave's one of us. He's neurodivergent in similar ways to me. Dave and Davina's are the biggest reason I still do this. I'm always very happy that the work I do is helping all the Adrians, Delias and Terrys, but the real work is in helping the Daves and Davinas of the world to understand that they're not freaks, weirdos or stupid. They're not broken or messed up in the way they think they are, and they certainly don't need to hide it anymore, because we know what autism is now, and we're getting better at knowing what it looks like every day. Every time I make a video like this, another Dave or Davina sees themselves in one of the stories I've told. Bells of recognition start ringing in their heads as they start to see that autism isn't actually this big, scary affliction they grew up hearing about. It's actually okay to be autistic, and knowing that's who we are is often the first step in rebuilding a shattered life. It's not adopting an identity or making excuses for past mistakes, just confirming we're not broken, just wired up differently. I don't think we'll come close to catching up with all the undiagnosed, unidentified Autistic Generation X Daves and Davinas before the last of us bites the dust. But that won't stop any of us trying. Hello again. I'm afraid it's been a bit of a rush this week again, so you get to see my stubbly incarnation today in my comfy cat cuddling shirt. I had the second infusion of my new arthritis drugs a couple of days ago, which took up a whole work day, so I'm playing catch up. All looks good on that, by the way, so hopefully I should be starting the home injections in a few weeks. If you watch the channel regularly, you'll know that this tea time format isn't how I usually do things, but it also seems to be working quite well. The main reason for the change was to free up some time to let me work on growing Autistic as a platform and get at least one book finished, but life has a way of getting more complicated to fill up any gaps that I open up, so it looks like I'll be doing tea times only for a little while longer. From now on though, the patrons bonus section won't be filmed as part of the YouTube video, but done as a separate video on Patreon. I haven't decided what it's going to be about this week yet, so it might be a surprise even to me. I chose to talk about this topic on YouTube today because of some of the responses to last week's research topic about making mistakes. Several of the responses reminded me of Terry and his informational perfectionism. When I read the William Hague thing too in the news, it kind of all came together. I asked last week about how we deal with making mistakes as autistic people. I'm interested in how you handle it when you get something wrong and bad things happen because of it. How does it make you feel? How do you react? And so on. I want to know how it feels different when you spot a mistake yourself compared to when someone points it out to you. And how do you deal with it when someone else suffers because you messed up? Now, I'm still interested to hear your input on the subject, but I did notice something in last week's comments that reminded me of Terry, and it made me both grin and cringe in recognition. It was expected that a lot of folks would describe how angry they get with themselves when they make mistakes, and how hard it is to discuss our mistakes constructively with other folks. But one thing did catch me off guard, not because I'd not heard of it before, but because it came up more often than I expected. A few folks implied that because mistakes are so mortifying to them, they make a point of never making mistakes anymore. That made me smile, because I can remember a time when I said something like that about myself. But it also made me cringe, because I remember how painful the fall was when I was ripped to shreds and proved wrong. I know what we're saying when that phrase tumbles out, but I only know that because I'm autistic. I know where it's coming from and what it really means most of the time. But as Terry faces every day, and as I learned to my cost years ago, people don't like it, and they can get very forceful in telling us. Before I did this, I worked for over 30 years in a completely unrelated industry. I started in the workshop, spent many years in retail, and eventually spent 15 years or so working in the business-to-business side of the industry. Back when I worked in the workshop, making and repairing things, where I probably should have stayed in retrospect, but, life, eh? In the workshop there, we all used to man a position along the process and do a stack of work which we pass on to the next technician and so on. On this day, I was doing the marking up, ready for the next stage, which was blocking up on the markings I was making. After blocking would come cutting, polishing, assembly, and so on. So if something goes wrong at the start of the process, that's a lot of time and energy wasted between then and the final checking. Long story short is that the boss shouted to stop the line because 3 completed assemblies had checked out completely wrong. The centres weren't only cut off axis, they were in completely the wrong place and a total write-off. Every reject came off our team bonus, so a balls up as bad as that would make you unpopular with the whole team. The finger pointed at me as the person doing the marking up. The first thought in everybody's head was that if things were off axis at the end, they'd been marked wrong at the start. But I knew something they didn't. My boss was shouting at me for being slack and not paying enough attention, but I knew how meticulous I was. I knew that I'd double and triple check myself every single job I touched. I'm autistic. I have a high sense of veracity, and whilst I don't find it as difficult as Terry does, I get the same bristly ick when something's out of whack. It means we go to much greater lengths than most folks would do to prevent mistakes. So when we actually do get something wrong, it feels like a huge failure, maybe even a fall from grace. The outside world calls it autistic perfectionism. A lot of us call it that too. But for some of us, me certainly, it's better described as a mortifying fear of making mistakes. It amounts to much the same thing, but it's motivated by very different needs. So the thought process that went through my head on being told I'd messed up 3 jobs on the trot went something like this. I can't have messed up all 3 so badly, because I check myself so thoroughly. I might have made 1 mistake, but that many? And so badly? And why were the centres all completely off as well? It made sense to me that either the sticky pads that held the blocks in place was failing, or something was off in the blocking process. Since the blocker head did get loose sometimes, and Tracy, who'd been blocking after me, had been loudly gossiping while she was working, perhaps it had worked loose without her noticing. So, what I wanted to say was, "Pardon me, boss. I can see that when jobs are off axis, you might look at the guy marking them up first, but I assure you that I've been paying attention, and I can't see me making that many egregious errors. Perhaps we ought to check out the blocker and the rest of the processes before making a hasty judgment." But what came out was, "I don't make mistakes." I got cut off before I'd finished the half-formed sentence of, "I don't make mistakes that often." The damage was already done. The boss somehow tore into me in a flying rage while simultaneously laughing his socks off. I was dressed down for my carelessness, my treachery, trying to point the finger elsewhere, and above all, my arrogance. How dare I suggest I was better than everyone else? Who did I think I was? God or something? Everyone makes mistakes. I tried to answer back that that wasn't what I meant, but it was too late. For the next few years, until I moved on and left the company, I was forever pointed out as the boy who never makes mistakes and laughed at. The thing is, whenever I hear or read another autist saying, "I don't make mistakes," I know what they really mean. It's not necessarily what I was thinking in that workshop 30 odd years ago, but not that far apart. What most of us mean is that we're so concerned about getting things right and not making mistakes that we take much greater care and keep checking ourselves more than people realise. We don't mean to say that we're superhuman, inerrant beings who never put a foot wrong, but we take such great care the chances are very low that we'd miss something out. So we'd appreciate people double-checking before they call us out, and we'd like some feedback on how to improve when we do mess up. Constructive feedback, not shouting or name-calling. Almost every autist I know can give me a list of triggers that push them towards meltdowns, wipe out their emotions, or send them into a whirl of confusion. But non-autistic people have them too, and one of the most common and potent of those is being called stupid. When we say, "I don't make mistakes," nobody hears that in their hearts. They hear, "I think I'm better than you," with a side of "you must be stupid" to add spice. So when you say to me, "I never make mistakes," I can read between the lines because they're autistic lines and I'm coded for that. But don't count on everyone else understanding. Oh, and if you really do try to convince me that you genuinely never make mistakes, that you really are that angelic super being who never puts a foot wrong or says the wrong thing, then just like when Terry first said it to me, I might not take you that seriously. That's all for this week. Keep on telling me your thoughts on how you handle making mistakes and, for that matter, how you deal with other people's mistakes when they affect you. Remember, this is my only source of income now, and I'm really trying to grow the channel so I can support my wife and I. So please do all the likey, subscribey, bell icon-y stuff and hit the hype button a couple of times if you see it. More of you are doing it every week, but I know not everybody sees it yet. And if you can afford to help me keep making videos and opening eyes to autistic lives, then you can sign up monthly on Patreon or bung me a tip on Ko-fi or YouTube thanks. Patrons also now get a bonus video every time I make a tea time video too. I'll leave you to it for another week then. I'm Quinn, and I'm autistic. Thank you for watching. We lived through times of incredible change when it came to public attitudes to disability, and we made great